We are absolutely delighted for our keynote address today to have the most wonderful lean practitioner and possibly a very high-profile practitioner, Professor Rufus Black, who is the Vice-Chancellor and President from the University of Tasmania. Professor Black, you're here. I was just going to do a very quick introduction for you, and then I'll hand over to you to share what you would like to share today. So, very quick introduction. Rufus holds degrees in law, politics, economics, ethics, and theology from University of Melbourne and from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. His research and writing have been published widely, and he's also authored a number of major reports for the Australian government, drawing on his expertise in ethics, management, and strategy. His commercial experience has included being a partner at McKinsey & Co, where he worked on strategy, organisation, and public sector issues. And it was at McKinsey that Rufus first used lean and went on to lead lean operations globally. In a really lovely touch, lean has been integral to his work ever since. And I think anyone who has studied lean or continuous improvement, it infects you and it influences how you see the world. Rufus has been a board member of the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, board member of Innovation Science Australia, director of the national law firm Cause Chambers Westgarth, and he's currently an independent board member for Deloitte Australia. He holds some incredibly interesting roles and has done some wonderful things around educational and social sectors, including Master of Ormond College, President of Museums Victoria, Deputy Chancellor of Victoria University, founding chair of the Board of Teach for Australia, director of the New York-based Teach for All, director of the Crandlana Foundation, and director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. I might hand over to Rufus now, and again, thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Great, look, thank you. Thanks very much for having me along. It's a real pleasure to be connecting with kind of a whole group of lean practitioners. I will get into the material that I want to share this morning and allow some good time for conversation, which I think is often the best part anyway. But let me offer effectively some kind of context setting and provocations that might help us generate an interesting conversation. So I'll just get some material up here. Hopefully, that all good. Great. All right, so the picture I want to paint is really a big picture story about where lean is fitting into the universities and the world that we are going to need by 2050. So it's a big picture story. What I want to do is to paint a picture about how global forces are reshaping our world, including our universities. And the fact that we need to respond to those with some urgency. That I, in fact, think as we do that lean is going to be a critical tool. So for both universities and societies to make the big transitions by 2050. But there will be some important, that comes with some important caveats, which I want to unpack about the centrality of the student and staff rather than the commercial kind of components to what lean is there to do. The fact that lean needs to take its place in a larger story about creating circular and zero carbon inclusive economies, the way it might engage with AI and how we probably need to use it, and something about the kind of adaptive mindsets we might all need as lean practitioners when we are deploying lean as a really important part of managing the era that we are in within and beyond universities. The picture that I think is important to paint is about the world that we now live in. And I'll spend just a little bit of time on this because it will highlight why it's going to matter so much and what the changing world is doing for universities. I want to tell a story about the world as it's changing, a world that is shaped by our population, the resource we have available, the productivity that we have, and how connected the world is. And the world that we knew really until the early 2000s is now a very different world, a world where once we had tailwinds, we now have headwinds and crises, and that we have a lot to respond to as we face into those. And there's an awful lot of our deeper mindsets and behaviours that need to change if we're to make those big adaptations. The world we knew, that post-war world, was a period of absolutely unprecedented economic progress, unprecedented in any area of human history. It was the least normal time that humanity has ever lived through. And you can measure it in lots of ways, but we measure it in some material terms. Just the growth in wealth per person across the planet has been absolutely extraordinary. With it came all sorts of gains in terms of declines in extreme poverty, inequality declining, life expectancy transforming the human experience of life on the planet, and even the degree to which people participated in shaping their societies. There were big forces that drove those changes. What I want to highlight is those big forces that drove this extraordinary period are now turned against us. Every single one of them now works against us where once it worked for us. The first of those forces, of course, our population. And that great post-war period experienced the enormous demographic dividend of the post-war baby boom of younger people entering the population year on year for a long period of time. At exactly the same time, women's participation in the workforce rose. So societies were getting a bonus every single year on year, all the way through to the early 2000s, where both in the developed world, but actually globally, we now see we're supporting more people every year on year, and the productivity gain of younger people is slowly eaten away. But we also face really a very daunting change in the shape of our population. Populations have never decelerated this fast before, other than in the Black Death. And that isn't a policy experience that is accessible to people. And if you want to get a sense of just how big that change is, compare a couple of the big shifts here. Here you've got the demographic pyramids of two very important European countries now and 2050. And you've got the dependency ratios, how many dependents we've got to working age population. When you look in Italy and Germany, by 2050, not very far away, we've got heading in Italy to nearly 1-to-1, one dependent person for every working age person in the population. And in Germany, we're at almost, we're heading very close in that direction. These are radical changes, and they're not just in Europe, in our own neck of the woods. Huge change is coming. Very similar in Japan. Remember, in Japan, they are closing a school every single week on average at the moment because their population is decelerating so fast. And if you look at China, it's pretty challenging by 2050, but then it faces a demographic cliff such as few societies have ever faced. If you look at that kind of where they're heading in 2050. Now, this is enormous change, and it slows the world up. It slows it up dramatically. Australia, the US, Canada, the big immigration societies, this isn't quite as dramatic, but it's still a powerful headwind. Now, what people do with their resources, and this is, of course, vital. We had an era of resource abundance, again, all the way through the early 2000s. Before we really entered an era of scarcity, where all of our non-energy materials have become costlier and costlier, and in a world where we are experiencing the cost of living challenges as dramatically as they are, this is a really critical shift to be observing as a real force. Now, when it comes to productivity, what does the population do with these resources? How efficient are they at turning them into things we value? The productivity picture was amazing. We've never seen a period of productivity growth like this in a sustained way. And as that saying goes, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. A great Paul Krugman quote. And it's essentially true. And we've seen an absolute revolution in productivity across this period, again, through to more contemporary times, but it has decelerated. If we break down and look, see what's happened in recently, we have seen productivity slow up down to a crawl. And, you know, the difference being, if we're down at the kind of 1% level that we're at now, we would only see economies doubling every 60 years rather than where they were every kind of 15 to 20 years. So it's a massive generational slowdown. And that weird COVID period is just because we lost lots of people out of the workforce, but we still produced a fair bit of output, which is a kind of a sort of false productivity spike. But the reality is resettled to pretty much where it was. A little bit of a spike in the US with some of the tech kind of driving there, but the rest, we're really seeing it very, very flat. And that is, you know, means that we are struggling to see real wages increase and to be able to fund all the things the world needs. And we'll come to the consequence of that for universities and others in a moment. It's a world where we've also seen connectivity. That post-war world saw connectivity completely transformed. Here we've got world trade by volume. You know, it was going pretty impressively, kind of 1,000% increase by the time we got to the late 80s. But when we got to the beyond, where tariffs hit a real low point, the Berlin Wall falls, the world integrates, the internet arrives, we've seen another 3,000% increase since then. It's a completely different degree of global connectivity, something like you've never seen. The world has never seen that kind of level of it joining up so fast. And of course, we saw it with the internet connecting the world up really over that same period. This has kind of been the high era of globalization. And that's really driven this extraordinary, it's been vital to distributing wealth globally in many places. Of course, it's come with issues and challenges that are very real. But the diffusion around the world and the connectivity of the world, the economic opportunity it's created has been remarkable. Now, of course, that was driven by falling tariffs and greater connectivity, and we've seen that change. US effective tariff rate's not a bad indicator of where global trade's at, and of course, we've seen something extremely strange happen in the last 9 months, but you can see it's pretty strange that it happened back in Trump 1, where that global trend headed in the wrong direction, and now it's really headed in the wrong direction. So we are seeing that connectivity slowing up, but it's not just in the tariff world. When we think about it, the connectivity that we had has been deteriorating now for some time, so that we've got global competition on every dimension. We've got it for spheres of competition, for geographic influence. We see that in our own region, but who imagined 20 years ago that Europe would be at war again, countries would be invaded, or that the models of government would be as contested as they are, or that the international order, that, you know, we've got very large number of countries in the world who have decided to sit it out on whether, you know, Russian invasion of the Ukraine is the wrong thing. Which is completely remarkable, really, given it's one of the most egregious violations of international law you can think of, and lots of countries not signing up to that. We've got access to resources that makes the kind of scramble for Africa in the 19th century look small compared to what's occurring, and then this race for global technology standards. Now, all of these big forces have some very direct impact on our society overall, but also some very direct impacts on universities. The demographics actually really matter. It's seeing around the developed world shrinking school leaver populations, but equally, and balanced by that, a growing need for education for the long life. With life expectancy stretching, the idea of retirement at 65 is kind of economically unsustainable. It's probably existentially unsustainable at some level if people are going to keep growing. So really big change. And that means that education needs to keep responding really significantly to this kind of really changed conception of life. The idea that you educate once for the rest of your life makes no sense in the rapidly changing nature of knowledge-intensive economies, particularly when people are living that long. It also changes where our research agenda needs to focus on a really wide front. On the resource front, all of those costs mean that there really are some pretty critical changes that we need to be making to help meet the resource scarcity challenge, to create circularity, and as we aim to move to a zero carbon economy, there are really fundamental changes, and I'll talk more about the importance of the whole circular agenda in a moment. But we need to be adapting to this kind of world and putting a huge amount of effort in doing it because it's so strong now. Productivity changes mean that we cannot expect more funding for universities. There simply isn't more money in developed economies for universities because there's pressures from health budgets as they age, as our populations age, from military pressures, from a breakdown of connectivity. There isn't going to be more money. So, and societies at the same time is expecting more from universities. So those changes means university productivity itself needs to increase significantly, and universities need to focus much more on delivering productivity gains for society, which in theory, they should be the kind of principal engines of that gain, given the knowledge they create. We also have the weakening of connectivity also is reshaping international student flows, and in a world of global competition, foreign interference is going to remain a kind of constant item on the agenda. So universities, which are part of the great global commons, actually need against those forces to be strengthening collaboration while being eyes wide open to that collaboration can create vectors for foreign interference and influence that is unwelcome, but it shouldn't cause us to stop doing it. So those headwinds alone are powerful forces reshaping universities. And you can see across that agenda that wherever you look on that front, you'll see obviously our story unfolds that actually operating in lean ways is kind of really fundamental to being able to adapt to that kind of environment. In order not just to enable us to have access to the resources we need to meet the productivity challenges that we've got, and effectively be able to create the space to reshape our agendas. But in that picture, it isn't just that we face headwinds. We face a more fundamental and profound need, which is actually to change the very model of economic growth that our world has been built on. I want to kind of offer some challenge to where it is currently at. Because our economic growth model has been built in the first instance on an extractive model. It's deeply extractive of our planet. And here we've got global consumption of resources versus population and GDP growth. We've got wealthier by extracting from the planet. If you look at the chart on the right, which is the rate at which we extract, the metabolic rate, which is how much materials do we consume per person per year versus gross domestic product per capita, there is a strong correlation. The wealthier countries are consuming more materials. It's now squared to about 60. It doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. And that means that we are still on a model where as you get wealthier, you consume more and more of the planet. Now, part of the challenge is this, of course, are non-renewable resources. That same logic has ended up applying to renewable ones. If we look across the board, I won't dwell deeply on these, but if you look at water, we now treat water as a non-renewable resource. That shows you demand versus supply. Demand up the top, we could make some improvements, we can increase supply, but we are entering a period of global water scarcity, which is kind of comes with the irony that, of course, with climate change, we have floods that are completely chaotic and disruptive, but they don't end up being captured for the needs that we have. So it's a kind of worst of all worlds when it comes to water at the moment. Soil we use as a non-renewable resource. The darker lines here show the consumption of it that exceeds the rate of its regeneration all around the world, and you can see those dark patches in critical food bowl parts of the planet. We are strip mining our soils. That challenge probably lies more in the kind of as we head towards and beyond 2050, but it's a very unsustainable way to run the planet. And then if we look at our forests, our grasslands, we are consuming them in deeply unsustainable ways. They're shrinking very rapidly as we feed the planet with the particular diets we have, with kind of extravagant forms of protein creation through very inefficient animals. So it's a real challenge. And of course, a not dissimilar picture that we've got in terms of our oceans, where we're exploiting them and collapsing the fish stocks in them, and at a really rapid rate. This is maps the lifespan of those of us who are middle-aged. The seas were far fuller of fish when we were born than where we are now. It's visible to those who spend time in the ocean. Now, all of that is happening because the world's populations are just eating food that requires an awful lot of that consumes meat, and meat is then you've got on the right of the chart just how much land required to produce a kilo of meat, and when the world's populations are getting wealthier, changing their diets to higher meat diets, the growing pressure is massive on our ocean, on our land stocks. So while we've got an extractive model, our model is also an emissions model. Same picture here as I had an earlier chart on the consumption, where we've got emissions per capita, wealth per capita, and you can see when it comes to greenhouse gas emission, the bubbles are the size of populations. We've got huge populations still climbing that curve. And as we know, the world is not on track to get our our greenhouse gas levels to sustainable kind of at all at the moment, and that pressure you can see is built into our economic model, and we're not doing a whole lot to change that. The extractive model continues in other parts of the economy, all other forms of waste, and at the same time we've got this running, we're driving inequality. Whether you measure it countries, people, places, income or wealth, it is growing. It's growing in every part of the world. If you look across these top 10%, bottom 10% of incomes, whether it's in the United States or kind of more socialized economies like Sweden, it's growing. It's growing in the developed world. It's even growing in the Asian tigers. And that inequality is seeing the middle class fall behind. This is US data. You can see the only line you need to look at really is the brown middle income line, which is declining income and wealth in the United States. If you want to understand Trump, this is the one chart you really need to look at. The deal that used to kind of buy people into the kind of politics that supported moderation, that when income, when a share of wealth in the middle class fallen to only 17%, vast swathes of America have no reason to buy into moderate policies anymore. And those inequalities, they're not just there, they're everywhere. And this is one I highlight because it's in our own hometown here in Hobart. Newtown, wealthy part of Hobart, life expectancy 87 years, 20 k's away, Bridgewater Grange Book 67 years, 20-year gap. Now I've started to look at that in other Australian cities. If you're in Melbourne, same gap between wealthy parts. If you go between Brighton and Dandenong, same issue. So we are seeing gaps that we used to see between countries, within countries, in a really big way. So there's an awful lot of people who are left behind. And you look in those suburbs, that's average. So you've got plenty of people dying in their 50s in these suburbs. That's different. We are not seeing that. So it's no surprise that we've got a decline in trust. Why would you support institutions? And here you've got a whole, some American data. Why would you not start trusting people when you start to see that? It's particularly, bad in some places. The US, we see the trust falling. It's falling in the UK, not quite as badly. Universities happily are kind of finding a little bit of a way back there. But it's not good. Now, all of this is happening at the same time that we have this picture, which is that the majority of jobs, future jobs, are going to rely on the skills and knowledge that higher education and other forms of tertiary education provide. So at the very time we're getting more skeptical, we're at the same era where we are moving into effectively universal tertiary education. Different countries have pegged those dates a little differently, but you can see the common pattern, whether it's what came out of the the Accord in the US by 2030, 70 nearly three-quarters of all their job openings are going to require post-secondary education. Canada sees that that's going to require by the early 2030s almost 80%. UK slightly different, but all massively happening. And in the middle of doing all of that, we get the AI revolution, which we are seeing enormous change, and human capabilities now doubling roughly every 7 months, now exceeding human capabilities in performance on multiple dimensions. And of course, they're in our universities. Those kind of on the right are just a couple of the tools I've built for classes that I teach. They are changing what we're doing significantly. And I think AI, as it changes our world, is set to change what we teach. And I think actually quite positively in lots of ways, because the human is going to matter more than ever. Human agency is going to matter more than ever. It's going to change how we teach, how students learn in powerful ways, in ways that actually might be good at limiting inequality. It'll change how we research. It'll change how we run university operations. So when we see that world of change, I think this is where and that's a lot to take in, I appreciate, but that's the big picture world we face. And that's why I think lean is going to be absolutely critical for universities and societies to make these transitions to 2050. Really critical. And effectively, across this era, we are going to need to be able to do a great deal more with less material input. And that, of course, is where lean has its special magic. As the important and valuable things we need to do, we find ways to do those things with less resources. So if lean isn't at the core of virtually all organizations, they will not be able to make these transitions. So I could make an argument that it really is a toolkit that virtually anyone that we're educating for the world today is going to need to have, and every organisation in some form or another is going to need to have as a mindset, or we simply will not be able to find the capacity to make these transitions that the world faces. As we do that, so in a sense, the argument, when you put all the data on the table for lean, is it's simple in the face of enormously complex challenges. And I think that's important, because when you face complexity, actually simpler tools are better than more complex tools. And lean is one of those pieces of the answer. But it does need to be very much first and foremost about improving our student and staff experience. I think if we are deploying lean simply to get the productivity gain, then we will not actually use it in the right way. And I know there's a bunch of lean practitioners that would make deep sense. We have to be deeply focused on how, in this world of complexity and challenge, we are simplifying the human experience, whether it is of our staff or our students, and that lean is removing the kind of wasteful clutter and complexity that gets in the way of the essential experiences. And I choose this image to kind of tell that story because this is eliminating just about everything. This is the ultimate lean classroom. It's a clearing in a forest. And in lots of ways, that's the original classroom. We go back to the kind of, to the ancient Greek world. That's where it begins, in clearings where you can have a symposium. So we need to be careful in this world of challenge that we are being as truly radical as we can. Now, there's one person who's got a bit of tech there, but essentially the power of that space is to have stripped everything else away and got back to the fundamentals of learning, which is people in peer relationships in a place having a compelling, memorable learning experience. Now, That's, of course, a challenging benchmark to set, but I think it does say we are in danger in the higher education sector of accreting all the time rather than simplifying back to the essence. And even when we've got digitally and technically supported education, which we will have a lot of, this isn't a case for not having online or not having tech as an integral part of it. We need to make sure that those experiences are trying to kind of come back to not add the 1,000 extra bells and whistles and additions, but going back to what are the essential experiences that create great learning, what are the immersive experiences that enable that to happen at its best. So I think when we're designing great learning and teaching, it needs to be like that. And similarly with staff experience, you know, we as the sector has acquired just vast arrays of systems. You know, our university has literally hundreds of them, all trying to talk to each other, all slightly different in the formats and requests. It's not a wonder people get super frustrated that it feels that these are vast bureaucratic behemoths that they're a part of that aren't kind of focused on them. It's because we built a world that is anything but lean. I know everyone on this kind of call is kind of deeply committed to changing that, but we will not be able to have the kind of staff experience that we need unless we are making life dramatically simpler again and focusing on the much narrower set of things that really matter to people so they can end up having and providing those experiences, whether they're academic staff or professional staff. We have to make the world simpler. And a lot of that will go to culture and trust. I look across universities and the amount of material that we put where we just have big values barriers, because an awful lot of what we require for people in amounts to checking. Here in our university, when we automated leave, so you didn't have to apply to leave, you just got granted leave automatically. That just puts trust that somebody's had the conversation with their manager, got sorted out. So when they put it in the system, the manager isn't going lots of checks. Now that's saved countless hours, huge amount of effort, hassle. And that wasn't a system change fundamentally, that was a trust change. And so there's a lot of cultural change, I think, that will support that. But that's the thing we've got to put at the front and centre of it, is our student and staff experience, and the resource back end will take care of itself if we do that. Really well. That will be important. Now, if lean is going to play its role, it needs to very deliberately be a part of ensuring that we are creating circular economies. This is, in a sense, the kind of the classic picture of the circular economy. And you can see that, in a sense, it is the ultimate lean system. Where, you know, if we look at the circularity, the first thing is, let's make sure we share the materials we've got. If we're going to once we've shared them, let's make sure we can reuse them, redistribute them, then we will remanufacture them, and then we'll recycle them. But first of all, we'll just use less of them. So every aspect of creating a circular economy is fundamentally an expression of what lean should be, but the two need to come together and be always part of it, because otherwise lean continues to support effectively an extractive emissions-driven economy, whereas it actually needs to be embedded in how does it help a fully circular economy to be as accelerated as fast as possible. We will not get out of our extractive, linear model of extract to emissions without lean helping us shift deep mindsets about how we use less, share it better, reuse it more often, and then at last resort, recycle it. So the lean world is a world where we really need to put a stop to how much more we extract and how much more we emit, and deploy all our techniques and make that a much more explicit connection. I have a sort of view that the words lean and circular should always be in the same sentence until we've really got that mindset set. And Australia, by the way, is just so far behind in the circular economy transition. It's embarrassing. A bare few percent of our materials are circular. There are economies in Europe that are pushing towards 20% of their materials are now circular. They have economy-wide plans, and they have a continental plan for moving to a circular economy. Every state has a plan. Many cities have a plan. Increasingly, every company has a plan. We are nowhere in this agenda, and the higher ed sector should be leading on it. I don't see that happening, and that is a real problem. But so this is a kind of cause I think all of us passionate about lean could get deeply involved in. Lean and AI are going to be a really important part of the kind of conversation, I think. This is where two kind of worlds come together. AI is obviously not without a series of quite complex challenges around its sustainability, the ethics of a range of its uses, its extraction of creative talent, plenty of issues there, but it is with us. And what we need to be ensuring as we build a next generation of technology, that we build it lean. I already see AI stuff that is just over-engineered. It is not lean in how it's been thought about. And there's always a danger at the beginning of tech cycles that you throw so much regulation and control at it that you get the balance wrong and you design intrinsically unlean things. And I think there's a lot of danger in that. And in fact, I see at the moment, probably part of why we're not getting that great a return on it is because we put so much, so over-designed some of it, that the amount of effort in the back end to what it does at the front end just is not actually much of a gain at all. So we need lean design. Is again, it's one of those things that I think lean and AI should be in the same sentence all the time, in the way we are designing what we are creating. And I just think of the kind of nightmare of legacy systems. We could easily recreate that problem with lean, with AI, if we don't take a super lean version to it and ask really hard questions about what we're using it for and how we're designing it. And the number of times I've seen, people just diving in and cutting lean code without actually saying what's the end user experience that I really need to create, prototyping and doing all of those kind of things. It worries me a lot. So I kind of think lean practitioners, this is time to lean into the AI world and rope it to our agenda. The final thing really is that we need to do lean ourselves, not outsiders. There's a real issue with kind of the outsider problem in universities at the moment. Obviously, that gets critiqued in terms of consultants. But the real problem is when that is happening is we are not building the capability ourselves. Now, I'm quite sure, and I see a number of university people in this kind of conference setting, that it's very much engaging with people who are very on this place. But I do still see a lot of outsider stuff going on. And lean has to be our own capability and tailored to our own needs, and built on our own philosophies about how it is to serve students, how it's to serve staff, how it's to serve the values of universities, and how in one sense we decommercialise it, that we take the often problematic commercialising language. Students are students, they're not customers, they're not clients, they're students. There's all sorts of commercial language gets smuggled in with these tools, and it's actually corrosive, and we need to be very careful. And the more we own it, the more we build our own logic kind of deeply inside it. And I think that's fundamentally important to it being effective. So it is a task for us. Now, I think a lot of that is when we come to it, lean practitioners in the world that we have, we need to embrace kind of having really adaptive minds, adaptive kind of ways of thinking rather than transactional ones. It's very easy to take a process and think about how do we lean it up. And that's still a good thing to do. It's a kind of transactional thing to do. But when we link it to these bigger trends that we need to see in the world, what lean practitioners increasingly are about is helping communities, in our case university communities, have adaptive conversations, how they do the fundamental rethinks, whether it is about simplifying and making the compelling student or staff experience, whether it is helping people go on often quite deep journeys of changing, evolving their academic or professional identities to adapt in the world we're in. If it is to be seeing, lean as a core part of circularity, that means if we've got a linear process in front of us, we just shouldn't be doing that. We should be working out how we turn the linear process into a circular process. And that is going to be a vastly more adaptive activity, because we're going to be asking much bigger, more fundamental questions about how we're doing things. It's going to be the same with the AI conversation. So I think the cutting edge of lean practice at the moment is connecting lean thinking to these bigger trends, and ensuring that lean is becoming a force for really deep adaptive mindset change. And lean at its best has always done that. Its origins really lie in a fundamental kind of challenge to previous understandings of how you could create by focusing on the valued experience rather than just on the cost. We're really challenging when in its foundations some really deep beliefs, and we couldn't get really good lean outcomes unless we challenged those deep beliefs. I'm probably arguing now that we need to, it's the next time for the next generation of lean to be challenging sort of really foundational mindsets about how our world is organized, and that it's a great tool for doing that, and indeed the changes, the adaptations that are needed, at their core have very fundamental, it's not the only thing, but it's an important thing. Fundamentally lean concepts are going to be essential to all of those changes. So that's the picture that I wanted to paint, really. The essence of the argument being that in a changed world, we are going to need to be building those kind of mindsets and capabilities across the board if we are going to adapt and make the changes the world needs by 2050. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Rufus. I think that was a really thought-provoking way to kick off our conference, to help us understand those global headwinds or those global drivers that we operate in as higher education, whether we're in Asia Pacific or if we're globally. We've got a couple of questions that have come through the chat, so if you're happy to answer those, I'll just read them out and We'll see where we go from there. So a question from Brent Hurley. Brent is joining us from Edinburgh. Thanks, Rufus, for such an insightful and frankly frightening presentation. Question is, in your opinion, when there's such a weight of evidence for the value of lean, why do so few organisations, including universities, adopt it, instead favouring more traditional management approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a really great question. I think essentially because on the whole, leaders have university leaders don't grow up learning how to do it or what it's about. So when you get senior leadership, they actually they don't know about it. They don't understand it, and they probably never used it. And that's a big barrier. So they resort to traditional techniques. Remember, the process for growing university leaders mostly doesn't involve exposure to this kind of stuff. Maybe you get kind of chief operating or finance officers, maybe, who've done it, maybe. But my experience is, unless you've kind of done something hands-on with it, you kind of don't really get how powerful, what a deep mindset change it is. So I think this is part of, it's interesting because you look at business school curricula, this stuff tends to be still on the optional list, which I find pretty shocking, frankly. It should be, no MBA should graduate without understanding lean. Nobody should leave a business degree without understanding lean. Really, I mean, I don't mind what varieties or flavors you put to it, but it is so fundamental that universities aren't putting it. We're not insisting it's in our curricula. I'm just actually having a conversation with our head of our business school about doing just that. as we revise our curricula. You know, like we shouldn't be graduating people who can't do this stuff. So I do think it's just the fact it has remained a marginal piece rather than central, and therefore gatherings like this that try and get people to see we've got to build it in centrally are really important to answering that question. But yeah, I still talk to Vice Chancellor. They don't know what I'm talking about when I say lean. You know, they think I'm talking some kind of meat. You know, it's not good.
Yep, I think what your response has just resonated with all of us, that we spend a lot of time talking about lean or continuous improvement. People who may have encountered lean go right back to the Toyota production system and then think, how can lean actually operate in a higher education or a services environment? So I think you're right, that piece of education is missing. Yeah, good question. Question from Jeremy from UTAS. Many conversations we have with lean practitioners in this community speak about the challenges of influencing others across the institution to embed a continuous improvement culture. Be keen for Rufus to share with the group any reflections on how university lean teams can influence academic and professional staff to embrace those principles and I suppose to have that adaptive mindset that you were talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And Jeremy, by the way, just does the most incredible work. So I appreciate him every day, really. This, I think, does go to this adaptive piece, Jeremy, which is, you know, a big part of if we're going to get these changes to happen is the larger adaptive mindset shifts that need to occur. It's part of why I was very keen to emphasise the importance of putting the student staff experience at the centre. It's part of getting that adaptive change. The more we are able to help people see it creating the compelling experiences, making their life simpler, once they get that it is actually not a management thing, it's not a cost thing, it's actually about improving their experience. And, you know, and you've done some great work in this space. You know, you've created some people real champions for it because they have seen that happen. But it's, in a sense, the challenge is you've had to do so much to get them to come on the journey to have a go, whereas we need to actually work to help people see that these things are, those experiences, simplified experiences, are possible, and that there are some tools to make it happen. I think it's part of the bigger, you know, in the academic world, there is just an intrinsic skepticism about anything from a commercial environment. And it is for the reasons that there are values conflicts between some of the commercial constructs and what universities are about. And there's a lot of trust building that still needs to happen to say that these tools are wholly usable in our environment if we are careful about the value system we are using them for. But that is ongoing work that we have to do in order to have people understand that these tools can be used to support our values, not undermine our values. And that is, again, a piece which I think there's a lot of, still a lot of work needed on.
I think you've possibly almost covered the next question as well, which was how do we tackle the cultural transformation to actually integrate lean into how a university operates and how it thinks. And I think that point you've just made around demonstrating that it links and aligns with our values or our value propositions, that it enables us to do our work is possibly, and that we can demonstrate the value, we can demonstrate improvement and demonstrate that commitment to simplification.
Yeah, and I think it also is, it is about connecting it to some of these trust things, to help people see that it's part of a package of trusting staff and students more. We face often, you know, regulators sometimes don't help because they actually, quite a lot of regulatory cultures drive to low trust cultures. They have an assumption that, you know, students will cheat and staff will not always do the right thing. And that drives this kind of low trust system in lots of ways. We need to work against that and to help people see that actually these kind of tools are part of building a much higher trust, simpler to operate kind of environment. So again, it's about not having lean over here, but having lean as an integral part of bigger changes that are needed, about higher trust, simpler ways of working, more focused on the essential student experience, more focused on creating as much staff time on the core things that really matter, less time on the admin stuff. So we've got to build it into the larger conversations.
Just picking up on what you said there around trust and regulators, noting that in Australia we've just had the release of the 8 governance principles for university governance. How do we manage that tension between seeking to simplify and continuing to have these growing levels of regulation and requirements and compliance?
Well, I actually think that governance report is a bit of a great watershed because it's actually very contemporary and simple. It aims to create, I think a lot of us in the sector were a bit worried that this would be the next level of detailed regulation of universities. Actually, the reverse. It's like, how do we ensure the essentials of governance are done well? It's for me a very positive direction for the sector, and it's a trust model, really. It actually doesn't seek to put more controls on governing bodies. It just tries to make sure they do their governing task. And again, it tries to build the essential governing task. Don't bolt on lots of other obligations. Just make sure you do the fundamentals of governance really well. And in fact, it strips out a lot of people wanted to add on lots of extra requirements, and it's rejected pretty much every one of them in favour of a return to very clear fundamental governance. So, there are some things that work for us, and that I think happily is one of them. And look, this again, this is a step towards a more trust-based system, and that's pretty interesting because the sector is really challenged because there's the low trust in the community. The response is regulate everything, control everything. I hope other people advising and leading see the example here. And look, there's some early indicators. The ATEC here, we have a tertiary education commission being created, may move in the same direction, high-level outcome-based goals rather than kind of micro-input controls. All of that will help.
Fingers crossed. We've just gone through our TEXA renewal registration, so if we could seek to move to a simpler governance approach, that would be helpful. You used the word commercialization, particularly around the word clients, customers, students. So we've got a question from Alexandra. How do we overcome the current narrative that university degrees don't deliver enough value for students when it comes to commercialise their abilities in the workplace? Do we need to rethink or develop new courses or new degrees? And how can lean influence the academic environment that tends to control how these types of degrees or educational experiences are designed?
I think we could take a kind of key lean thing. Let's put the user right at the centre. Plenty of university processes aim to do that, where we put, I'm a big fan of a students as partners model, where we bring students more and more into the kind of core of actually shaping the experience. And of course, industry community who are living with the outputs of the university at the core of that. We need their voices at the centre of our design processes. That can be challenging because they can tell us, a bunch of these things you're teaching our students, we never use them, they're not relevant. Here are all the things we wish they really could do. We need to put the voices that describe the value of what we do at the very centre of our design processes. And we kind of sometimes on paper do that, sometimes we do that modestly, but if we were doing it as radically as is needed, then I think a lot of that would start to fall away. The other piece, I think, and it was kind of, I lightly touched on the AI conversation, we've got to make sure that the thing that is really valuable is the human decision-making creative capacities. In some ways, the most traditional things we do, which is teaching people to be great thinkers, able to produce creative, imaginative output, and perhaps we don't have to focus enough on this, but work really well with others to do those things, in an AI tech-driven age, that's the human advantage. And universities need to be ensuring we create the human advantage, what I describe as expanding human agency and creative capacities. And if we do that, I think we'll find, again, that people will value what we do. But we should listen. If people are saying this degree is not delivering what we need, we should listen carefully and bring that voice inside. Don't leave it on the outside.
Do you think you also talked about the concept of lifelong learning, particularly as we are tending in some areas to have longer life expectancies and retirement ages will be increasing. How do we navigate having such a diverse student population that we're trying to both listen to and design for and put at the centre of what we do?
I'm not sure that's super complicated. I mean, we only have 20% of our university as school leavers. You know, our biggest cohort are women over 40. That's just about making sure that we are attending to the different segments of our student population and putting in place the right ways in which we hear and get input from them. You know, so a little bit more complex. But the more we're attending to the fact that our students have never been homogenous, the better job we're going to do anyway. I think it just requires us to do that, and recognizing that different of the things we offer will also probably have larger, you know, be more variedly covered. There is foundational stuff that probably, you know, will be slightly overweight to a younger group. There's more pieces which are, you know, where we're building on things, would be slightly to older groups. But that's not the only diversity that matters anyway. I'm not sure universities, well, they just don't. We don't, you know, when I think about just how lack of universal design for learning across the university system we have, we're not attending to diversity very well in our practice, really. When I look at how well we accommodate neurodivergence, I'm a dyslexic person. My university experience as an undergraduate was horrible. I'm not sure it's actually changed that much. In terms of how do you support people with dyslexia in the core of the system. It's all bolt-on add-ons. You kind of identify it as a person with a disability. You get special consideration. We haven't designed it to include people like me even now. So I think what it does is require us to have a more inclusive attention to the true diversity of our student population. That's got to be good.
I think that's probably a wonderful note to leave on, that acceptance and inclusivity, understanding the diversity of our populations and designing for everyone. I'd like to thank you again for spending some time with us this morning, Rufus. I think you have set an incredible context for us to have the rest of our conversation throughout the next 2 days. And yes, thank you. Lots of reactions here. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Great. I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thanks for having me along.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Wow, what a great way to start the conference. What we're going to do now is actually go for a little bit of a break, because we think it's time for everyone to stand up and move around and stretch and go and get some sunshine or maybe some moonlight, if that's where you are at the moment. So we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. Go and walk around, do what you need to do. We'll be back here in 15 minutes for Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. That will be 11:45 a.m. This link will continue, so you can drop in and out as you need to, but we'll see you back soon.